I'm Michael Langemeier from the Center for Commercial Agriculture. Today I'm going to talk about crop break-even prices. Why do we need to compute break-even prices? Well, today I'm going to talk about a couple different reasons why we need to compute break-even prices. One of those is we need to use break-even prices when we're developing marketing plans. And so if we want to know how much corn to sell, or when to sell our corn, or when to sell our soybeans, often it's very useful to know the break-even price for corn and soybeans so we know when we're getting a good price. And so it's very helpful when you're developing marketing plans or carrying out your marketing plans. Also, which is a little less focus of the presentation today, we use break-even prices to examine the relative profitability and competitiveness of an enterprise. For example, if we want to look at the relative profitability or cost of production for continuous corn and rotation corn, calculating break-even prices for both is a very good way to do that. What costs should be included in computation of break-even prices? This is very important, particularly if you're looking at a publication that's talking about break-even prices, is you figure out what they're talking about. Quite often I'll run into people say, well, my break-even price for corn is $3, or my break-even price for corn is $3.50. The next sentence out of my mouth is, what costs have you included in that break-even price? And it varies all over the board in terms of what people use to compute break-even prices. Should we use cash flows? Well, using cash flows is very useful if you're looking at something like purchasing land. To see if see if you can afford to purchase the land based on your corn and soybean production or wheat production, whatever crops you have. What about opportunity costs? An opportunity cost is something like putting a value on owned land. Should we include those in our break-even prices? I contend that we should. And so most enterprise budgets use economic costs rather than cash costs, and so we include cash costs, depreciation, and opportunity costs in our computation of break-even prices. An opportunity cost represents the income that could have been earned if an input was sold or rented to someone else. And so that's your basic definition of opportunity cost. Because they are included in an enterprise budget, the bottom line figure represents an economic profit or loss, or earnings or losses. And so there's going to be some years where there's going to be an economic loss, and some years where there's going to be an economic profit. For example, in 2021, we're looking at an economic profit for most people for both corn and soybeans. If you go back to 2019, we were actually looking at an economic loss, meaning that we were not able to cover all of our cash depreciation and opportunity costs. Over a long period of time, due to the fact that all inputs are being paid the market rate, including these opportunity costs, economic profit is zero. If economic profit is positive, input prices will be bid up, similar to what happened to cash rents from 2007 to 2013. More specifically, as we entered the ethanol boom, corn price and soybean price for that matter, because we had very strong export demand for soybeans, corn and soybean prices started to increase. Landlords saw that there was good net return to land, and cash rents were bid up. And so this is what typically happens when you're looking at strong economic profits over a period of time. Let's go back to 2021. 2021 is a year of very strong economic profits. Does that necessarily mean that input prices are bid up because of that? Well, 2021 is a very special year. We've got supply chain issues, inflation, and other things going on. But even if those things weren't going on, we would see some tendency for input prices to be bid up because of the strong economic profits. And usually, in particular, input prices are bid up in terms of cash rents. And so see an increase in cash rents is very common when you see economic profit for a year or two. What are opportunity costs that need to be included? If we want to benchmark a farm's costs to those from other farms, it is important to include both cash and opportunity costs in our budgets, like I indicated. By including opportunity costs in your enterprise budget, you can determine whether you're covering all input costs. What are some of these opportunity costs? Well, the big ones are land, machinery, and labor. Proxies for all of these, Land, we can use cash rent. So local cash rent can be used to put a value on our own land. Obviously, the other ground that we're renting is either crop share or cash rent, so you're going to use that value in the budgets. But for our own land, you can use cash rent as a proxy. For machinery, what I typically like to do is look at crop machinery investment per acre and then use that figure to come up with a depreciation and interest charge for machinery. And this accounts for the fact that you may own all of your machinery, and so there may not be any cash cost with respect to machinery ownership costs, but there's still economic cost. We still could put that money to use in some other investment. That money that we have invested in crop machinery, which is very large on today's farms, could be put in the stock market, could be put into land, could be put into alternative investments. And so we want to calculate a depreciation, interest, or machinery ownership cost for machinery. Labor, well, hired labor, obviously you're going to have an expense for that, so that should be included in the budget. When you're talking operator labor, the way I like to handle that is to look at owner withdrawals that are directly related to the crop enterprises. If it's just a crop farm, just look at all the owner withdrawals for that farm. Owner withdrawals are typically money that's taken out for family living, for example, and then divide that on a per acre basis to come up with an opportunity labor cost related to family and operator labor. We will use a case farm in west central Indiana to illustrate the computation of break-even prices for corn and soybeans. These estimates represent projections made for 22 crop in early December. If you've been following the input price markets here this fall and going into the winter, there's been a lot of volatility and a lot of increase in fertilizer prices and other inputs, and so it's very important to keep in mind that these are December estimates. I update estimates on the Center for Commercial Agriculture website on a fairly regular basis, and so you can look on the center's website for updated projections related to corn and soybeans. This case farm has 3,000 crop acres, of which 750 acres are owned. That's important because overhead costs, particularly machinery ownership and labor costs, are dependent on farm size. So what I like to do is look at the top 6 categories in terms of corn and then look at those costs on a per bushel basis for both corn and soybeans. And I don't necessarily need to dwell on all of these numbers, but I've got these listed in order in terms of the most important costs for corn, and then I've just used the same methodology looking at soybeans. And so these are the 6 top input categories. There is other things such as dryer fuel, insurance, crop insurance, interest, and those kinds of costs that are not included, and so that's why I have a subtotal here. The difference between the total cost and the subtotal is these other costs. But when you look at corn, the largest costs are land, fertilizer, and machinery. Land is about $1.45 per acre using this case farm. That could be a little lower in other parts of the state or a little higher. So that does vary across Indiana. Fertilizer is about double compared to what it was last year at $1.43 per bushel. And the machinery, which has both variable and fixed components because we've got repairs, fuel, machinery ownership costs in there, is the third largest at 68 cents per bushel. Machinery and labor vary tremendously across farms, and so it's very important that you put your own numbers in there for machinery and labor in particular. Some of these other costs do not vary quite as much, but it's always nice to benchmark some of these other costs with your own fields, your own farm situation. When it comes to soybeans, land accounts for a very large percentage of the total cost for soybeans, and we'll see this in a figure here in a little bit. Fertilizer is not quite as important because you don't have the nitrogen fertilizer, and machinery is also very important for soybeans. And so overhead costs in general are very important for soybeans because we don't have that very large fertilizer cost like we have for land. The break-even price for this case farm in early December was $5.32 for corn and $12.01 for rotation soybeans. And so when we're thinking about marketing the 22 crop, which obviously we haven't even planted yet, but when we're thinking about looking at futures price for the fall and winter of 2022, these are the break-even prices that we can use to examine that for this farm. Looking at a diagram of this, sometimes it's better to look at this in terms of shares. And so it's the same information that was on the previous slide, only here I've included all costs in there. I've got that other category in there, and so the other is there. And so it's communicating the same information, but cash rent represents 27% of total cost. That's because fertilizer right now is about 27%. If you looked at this a year ago, fertilizer was much smaller and cash rent was closer to 30%. So cash rent typically is the largest expense item for farms looking at producing rotation corn. The same would be true for continuous corn. Looking at rotation soybeans, land accounts for almost 40% of the total cost of production for rotation soybeans. And so here just illustrates the importance of making sure you have an opportunity cost on owned land. If you don't have that in there, you're really not accurately depicting the break-even price for soybeans, because that's a huge component of the break-even price for soybeans is cash rent. If you have a rotation corn, rotation soybeans split 50-50, and so you rotate the corn and the soybeans and don't produce continuous corn, don't produce continuous soybeans, don't produce wheat, you're looking at about a third of the total cost for those two crops accounted for by cash rent or owned land. And so that's where we come up with the 1/3, 2/3 crop share lease. With 1/3, 2/3 crop share lease, the landlord gets 1/3 of the crop, and all the revenue, essentially crop, government payments, and crop insurance payments, and the operator gets 2/3. That works fairly well. If you look at the percentages on the last two figures, that comes out very accurately to their share of the costs. Looking at this over a little longer period of time, I'll do that for both corn and soybeans here to conclude. Corn, the 5-year and the 10-year average break-even prices, it increased all the way up to about 15. As we started that ethanol movement in 2007, cost of production increased, particularly cash rent increased dramatically for a few of those years. And so we saw an increase in the break-even price, and the break-even price was close to $5. If you look at the 5-year average in 2015, then we started to see some declines in cash rent, some tapering off of some other costs. Fertilizer was relatively high in 12 and 13, and then came down until 22, really, for the 22 budget. And so we saw some decreases in break-even prices. We got down there, if you look at the 5-year average, we got down there close to $4 corn. Now with a higher fertilizer cost, higher herbicide costs, higher cash rent expected for 22, the break-even is at that 432. And so the reason why charts like this are important is when you're looking at the competitiveness of corn for your farm compared to other farms, many times it's better to look at a long-term average than just 1 year. Why? Well, 1 year largely reflects weather. And so you might look like a genius in 2021 because you had a very good year, or vice versa. If 21 wasn't very good for you, your break-even could be substantially higher than someone's. And so when you're looking at this competitiveness between farms, between crops, it's better to look at a long-term average than just 1 year. When you're developing a marketing plan, typically you're only looking at that 1 year, and that's why I talked about the 2022 budget projections earlier. Soybeans, looking at the same thing here, we saw the same trend for soybeans, an increase in break-even prices from a 5-year average standpoint. That's the blue bars here, all the way to 2015. Then we saw some declines in land value. Also, fertilizer costs were lower for soybeans from 13 to 20 than they were 11, 12, and 13, and so that also helped. We also had some reduction in seed costs for both corn and soybeans, and so the break-even price declined all the way through about 21, and then it's expected to increase in 22 as we see higher cash rents, higher phosphorus and potassium costs, and higher herbicide costs. And so right now this farm looks like a long-run average of about $10.50 for soybeans. There were some years in there where it was below $10 looking at the 5-year average. And again, if you want to look at soybean break-evens compared to other farms, you would want to use these longer run averages rather than just 1 year. Use the 1 year if you're developing a marketing plan. In conclusion, computing break-even prices enables a farm to compare the profit potential of alternative enterprises and to formulate marketing plans. When computing these break-even prices, it's important to include cash, depreciation, and opportunity costs. If you want to look at a break-even price related to a particular piece of ground in terms of affordability of that land, by all means, you can use cash costs, which will include principal payments. For example, when you're looking at break-even prices, principal payments are not included in the break-even. Rather, we use opportunity costs, would include opportunity interest on operating expenses, opportunity interest on machinery, and opportunity interest on land values, which is embedded in cash rents. More information pertaining to the production costs and financial benchmarking can be found on the website for the Center for Commercial Agriculture. In particular, updates regarding corn and soybean prices are published on that website on at least a monthly basis.